Today, I've got a campaign expansion for a really popular board game that you can play solo and also doesn't take 9,000 hours to complete. That's the Lost Ruins of Arnak, The Missing Expedition. This is an expansion for the Lost Ruins of Arnak that came out back in August of last year, released at Gen Con, and has been widely more available since then in the past couple of months. And the big thing that this expansion adds for the Lost Ruins of Arnak is a campaign. So you're able to either solo or two-player play a campaign, a 6-chapter campaign with the Lost Ruins of Arnak. So I'll talk a little bit about that campaign without giving away any big spoilers. I'll also go over some of the other things that are included in the box and what you get with this expansion. So let's dive in. So this expansion obviously comes with a lot of campaign content, which I'm not going to show you. In fact, I'm not going to show you content that's in here just because I don't want to spoil anything. I want to make sure that you get the full experience if you do pick this up and if you want to play spoiler free. So what does this come with? Well, one of the first things that it comes with is a lot more item and artifact cards, and you're going to encounter those throughout the campaign, but they can also just be mixed right into your base content for Lost Ruins of Arnak. So if you don't want to play the campaign, in fact, they even say in the rule book, like, hey, if you just want to nix the campaign and you just want to use this stuff in the base game, feel free to do that. So that's a really great pro for this expansion, is that all of it can just be mixed in super seamlessly, but you get some more items and you get some more artifacts. You also get 2 new leaders in this campaign expansion, which are the journalist and the mechanic. Now, you may have the leaders expansion, which is going to add a lot of different variability to the Lost Ruins of Arnak, and also some different player powers, things that change the game up a little bit, different strategies that you might try out when you're playing a game. The same thing happens here with these 2 new leaders. I've played with both of them. I'll give you my thoughts on them coming up in just a little bit. Also, this comes with some new assistants just to add to your assistant stack, some new guardians as well, some new sites that you can use. They tell you not to use those during the campaign though, so you'll just use those when you play the base game, and also some idols that you add in as well, and also a new research track too. So a double-sided research track. So you've got that all included in this box for the Lost Ruins of Arnak, The Missing Expedition. So let's talk a little bit about the campaign without trying to give away, any spoilers. So this is a 6-chapter campaign, and you are kind of going on, like it says on the box, an expedition. So you're going to pick a leader out at the beginning of every chapter, and you can change those leaders as the campaign goes on. So maybe you play one game and you're like, man, I really liked using the journalist in this game, but I think the mechanic might work better in the next game. Well, you can flip-flop and swap them out as much as you want from game to game. So it gives you a lot of variability. You don't have to use the same leader for the entire campaign. And each game in this campaign is going to kind of change your strategy for that particular game. And it's more of scenarios than really like a campaign, which I'll get into here again in just a minute. But you've got these different chapters that you're going to play through, and each game is going to force you to kind of use a little bit of a different strategy. So one, you might really have to focus on this certain area, and another, you might have to focus on this certain area, or it might add some new gameplay mechanics. So all of that's going to factor in with the campaign for the Lost Ruins of Arnak. So I'm going to give you some of my pros and cons for this campaign, and just some things to think about as well if you're considering purchasing this and adding it to your base game for the Lost Ruins of Arnak. So some of my pros, my number one pro is just how much stuff is in the box. This is going for right around $30 MSRP. That is incredible value for what you get here. I mean, you get a 6-chapter campaign, you get more stuff you can throw into the base game, like I mentioned, those 2 new leaders, lots of other added content, really great expansion here for the Lost Ruins of Arnak in just terms of stuff. And I know that's not the only thing that you judge expansions off of is how much stuff it's giving you, but in this case, it is really providing you with a lot of value for not a ton of money, which is really nice to see. And already the base game of Lost Ruins of Arnak has a lot of that going on too. It's not super expensive, but you get some really nice resources in there with like the tablets and the arrows and the gems. You've got a lot of variety just in that base Lost Ruins of Arnak game with all the cards that are included and the guardians and sites and everything. You're not going to see all of those in one game for sure. So this just adds to that and is a really great value. So my number 2 is the campaign. Like I said, introduces some new strategies and some things to focus on with every chapter. I really like the variedness so far. I've played 4 of the 6 chapters of the campaign, and every game I've got to use a little bit of a different strategy, try a different, way to win out to try and defeat that chapter of the campaign. So I like that they're not all the same. You're not just going through every chapter and doing the same thing every single time. You're going to be doing different things while still, playing that base Lost Ruins of Arnak, still researching, still defeating guardians, discovering sites, buying cards, building up your deck. All that is still in play. There just might be some different ways that you do it when you play through the campaign. Another thing I really like is the campaign is not insanely long, and you don't really see that a lot with campaign games nowadays. Now it's more, hey, we've created this 40-hour campaign, this 80-hour campaign. You've got so much content in here, you're never going to be able to finish it all. And that really is the case a lot of times, right? Like you're working through the campaign. You're like, how much do I have done? I'm only halfway through. I've played this for 20 hours. Do I want to continue? The nice thing about this is that it is only 6 chapters. And the games, when I played them, took an average of 45 minutes to an hour to complete. So if you think, if you decide that when you lose a game, you're going to go back and replay that chapter, you're looking at maybe 8 or 9 hours for this entire campaign from start to finish, which is a really nice length. And if you're a fan of those shorter campaigns and want to feel that sense of accomplishment without having something that is so long, this might be a really great option for you to pick up. Another thing is you can fall forward. So that's one thing that I really like is when you complete a chapter of this campaign, you can say, I'm going to retry that again if I didn't win or if I didn't do the objectives that I needed to get done, or I can just accept the loss and then I'll start the next chapter with a penalty, but I'm able to go to that next chapter. That's really nice. Sometimes, again, with campaign games, what gets really annoying is if the campaign is telling you, hey, if you fail this, you have to go play this again. You cannot pass this until you win. There's no way for you to continue on if you fail. Lost Ruins of Arnak does not do that. It's very accessible. It's saying, hey, if you lost this game, don't worry. Just go. If you want to go on to the next one, great. You're going to start with a little penalty, or the solo opponent that you're using is going to maybe have a little bit of an advantage. But other than that, you can go into the next game, the next chapter, and just continue through the campaign. Another thing is the new leaders that they have in this box are really interesting. They add some new strategies in terms of how you might play. So again, I mentioned the journalist and the mechanic. The journalist is trying to collect these articles, and they're going to be out at the sites on the board. And when you go to that site, what you can do as an additional action, if you have the card to do it, is to take one of those articles and add it to your board. And then you can spin those articles to write basically full-length newspaper articles, and that's going to allow you to do certain actions that are going to be advantageous to you throughout the course of the game. So that's kind of just an additional thing that is added on. I did like it. I think it works better in some chapters than others throughout this campaign. Sometimes it's not really helpful to have that be an option, but other times it is really helpful if you need to just try and get some more actions or some more variability in terms of what you can do. Then you have the mechanic, who is also really fun to play with. They have like an action selection wheel going on. We're going to spin it every so often and be able to take one of those actions that's on the wheel. So again, just adding some more things in that really vary up the play. And if you have that other expansion, the Expedition Leaders expansion, you can really vary this up when you go through the campaign. I mean, you can play the campaign multiple times with different leaders, and I switched out my leaders during the campaign. Like, one was working really well for the first couple of games, and then I got to like chapter 4, and that one wasn't working so well, so I swapped it out, tried a different one. And that is definitely a positive for this expansion for the Lost Ruins of Arnak. So another thing I like is the campaign works great solo. Obviously on this channel, we focus on solo board games and solo modes for board games. Well, the case with the Lost Ruins of Arnak is the solo mode for the base game is already really great. It's super simple. If you haven't played it, you have these tiles, and you've got a solo opponent that you set up, and they're going to have workers, and they're going to go block spots and take cards and take idols, guardians, things like that. But all you do is you flip over the tile and you see what it's going to tell you to do. It's a very simple action. It's going to say either, hey, put this worker on the space where they would get the most coins or the most compasses, or they're going to discover a new site, or they're going to move up the research track. So all that stuff is still in play here in the expansion for the campaign. Now, I will say every chapter, you're varying that solo opponent up a little bit. So you might take out one of those tiles in a certain chapter. You might add 2 of the same thing in another chapter. There may be a chapter where you're not really worrying about researching a ton because the solo opponent isn't researching, but then other chapters, they're climbing up there really fast. So there's a lot of variedness with the solo opponent and how they use it. And if you were to play this 2 players, you would still have that solo opponent in there as well, except to be a 2-player opponent at that point, but basically just to block you a little bit and to create some conflict throughout the game. Also, it scales really well. The solo versus the 2-player version of the campaign is very similar, but some objectives are just slightly tweaked. So like maybe you have to do 10 of something for the 2-player version of the campaign. And well, if you're playing by yourself, you'll have to do that 5 times. So they really make it nice that you don't feel like it's going to be harder because you're only playing by yourself. They have scaled it down to really work out well with only 1 player. And I really, really like that. That's a great design decision because sometimes, again, in these campaign games, they can be really tough playing solo. You just feel like you're underpowered, or you can't get everything done, or you don't have enough resources or cards or whatever the case may be. That is not the case in the Lost Ruins of Arnak, the Missing Expedition. It works great solo. And then another like that I have is that the difficulty is set well, and you can change it to make it easier or harder. So they have a lot of stuff in their rule book that lets you vary it up a little bit. And then for each of the individual chapters, they will have at the back of the chapter setup a section that says, hey, if you want to increase the difficulty for this chapter, do this. If you have, want to decrease it, make it a little bit easier, do this. And that's really nice because I lost 2 chapters. I decided not to accept the loss, and I played them again. And both of those times I just made the difficulty just a slightly bit easier so that I could complete it. It was still tough, don't get me wrong. It's not going to drop it down to like just a cakewalk through these chapters, but it is going to give you some help, maybe a card that you need, maybe a tile that you need, maybe some extra starting resources, and it will make it a little bit easier in terms of completing the goal for that particular chapter. So those are a lot of my likes with the Lost Ruins of Arnak, the Missing Expedition. Overall, a really solid campaign, really quick campaign, and one that works fantastic solo. In fact, I think if you're a solo player and you have the Lost Ruins of Arnak, you should definitely pick this up. It is a great addition. That being said, I do have just a few dislikes with this box overall, and just a few things that happen throughout the campaign. So one of my dislikes is some of the leaders don't work great in the campaign, especially if you have the Expedition Leaders expansion. Now, some of them work really well, like the one that gives you an extra worker, the captain. He's great. You're going to need that extra worker a lot, especially when you're playing solo. Again, it's not any harder than if you were, or any easier if you were playing 2 players, but sometimes you just need those extra action spaces to be able to get more resources or do what you need to do in that particular chapter. Some of the leaders I tried, like I tried the Falconeer, didn't work super great during the campaign for the game I played with her. Again, the journalist works okay, but he's not the best. The mechanic definitely works better in certain situations. So I get that some of that is strategy based in terms of, hey, you tried this out with this leader. It didn't go super well. Maybe you want to switch for the next time that you play. And I totally get that. But I think there could be just a little bit better balance there with all of the leaders so that if you swapped them out, you wouldn't feel like you're underpowered going into that particular chapter of the campaign, and you don't feel like connected to just use one leader the whole time. Now, like I said, you definitely can, and you can also switch, but just know that if you do switch, I found some trouble with certain ones using them in certain situations. Another dislike is probably maybe my biggest dislike with the campaign, and that's when you gain cards throughout the campaign, they go back in their respective decks. So you might get to use them for that next chapter, depending on what type of card you're gaining, but it also might just get shuffled into the item deck or the artifact deck. I don't love that because those decks are really big, and when you're playing by yourself, you're not really going to see that many cards. Now, the solo opponent is going to take cards from time to time, but in terms of the overall deck size and the amount of cards that you're going to see, it's not going to be that many at all. So I don't love that when you gain those cards and when you complete those objectives and you feel like, oh, I got a really good card here, it just goes back into the deck the next game, and you just have to wait for it to pop up. I would like another option where either that gets added to your starting deck, which would make your starting deck really big by the end of the campaign, so I could see why they don't do that, or I would like the option to maybe pick Like say, hey, look at all the cards that you've gained throughout the campaign so far, and choose 2 that maybe you want to add to your starting deck for this particular chapter. I just don't love that they just go back into the decks and then you just got to wait till they pop up again. And even if you wait till they pop up again, you may not have the coins or the compasses that you need to buy them at that particular time. The solo opponent may take it before you're able to get it. So all of those things factor in. And then to wrap this up, I had not really dislikes, but just some things to consider if you're thinking about getting this expansion for the Lost Ruins of Arnak. So the first thing is there's not a ton of story in this campaign. Now there is some, and there is a general story that you're going through. Again, it is an expedition. The title definitely tracks with what's happening throughout the campaign. But if you want something where you're really reading from a big storybook and diving in and reading a lot of text, like something like, a Tainted Grail or Sleeping Gods or something like that, that is not going to be the case here. It is very short paragraphs of reading. You don't do a lot of reading throughout the campaign. So just keep that in mind if you're somebody that really likes those story-focused campaign games. This is a little less story. You still got it, but it's not as much as some of those other games that have those really big storybooks. Another thing to consider about this campaign is you can't play it with more than 2 people. And obviously, if you're on this channel, that's not really going to be a problem because you're probably likely playing games solo for the most part. But if you do want to bring this out with a group or your family or something like that, just know that the campaign is not compatible with more than 2 people due to the amount of cards and how other things work throughout the campaign. So that's just a few things to look out if you are thinking about getting this expansion. But overall, like I said a little bit earlier, a really great expansion for the Lost Ruins of Arnak, the Missing Expedition. It's available widely now. It adds a ton of content. The campaign is really, really fun and a lot of different varied ways to play, and it doesn't take that long either, so you feel like you can get through the whole thing. All of those are big positives. Those negatives I had were very just minor things. Overall, this is a great expansion and a really solid campaign. So thank you so much for watching. If you want to like and subscribe, that definitely helps the channel out. Check out some of my other videos. I've got some other just board game related videos. I've got some reviews on other games and checking out their solo modes. So look at all that. Thank you so much for watching. Until next time, I'm Jared. You've been checking out Specifically Solo.